Thank you. Can I say a big thank you to the conference organisers and to the previous speakers. A brief introduction to myself. My name is Zaffira Shah. I have a background in social work and in training and development and supervision. The last 20 years have been predominantly working with training and supervision, and those are areas that are very close to me. So I'm really pleased to be talking about this area that, as Maya has also said, is very neglected. Very neglected. Maya and I have had a disadvantage. We are both before lunch. We are also on subjects that are asking you to engage your mind rather than your hearts. So there's a slight shift there to the cognitive engagement. So bear with us, and hopefully it will be an interesting kind of session. And I think there will be some overlap with your work as well. So we've heard a lot about the impact of sexual trauma on the child and the impact on children's thoughts, their feelings and their behaviours. I certainly can recall kind of working with children, and we've heard from people's own experiences of children they've worked with, and also their personal experiences of how they began thinking about themselves, how they started feeling about what had happened to them, and how it manifested in different, often problematic behaviours or challenging behaviours. So there is a lot of work and a lot of attention to this. Where there has been less attention is what is the impact of this work on workers, on their thoughts, on their feelings, and their behaviours. And some of that work has been already covered in Maya's presentation. But certainly if I go back to some of my early work, I was dealing with a large-scale sexual abuse case. It was organised crime. There were several victims. There were several perpetrators. I had some experience behind me, and so I was deemed as somebody who was very confident, very able, and things. And there's very little attention given to these areas, but certainly through that process, I know that I began thinking, do I know enough? Am I good enough for this work? Am I doing the right thing? Am I serving the children that I need to serve? And I began to feel quite anxious. I started feeling that maybe I'm not doing the right thing. And behaviours, you know, I had sleepless nights. I struggled with those, I was anxious. It was a time when I started smoking, and I still am. And you know, it shows that how those things begin to affect us, and we have very little attention on those. So one of the syndromes that I wanted to present is the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but I will go through it as a kind of a stage. The syndrome itself helps us understand how children experience abuse. It's by somebody called Roland Summit, and it was developed in 1983. It's a widely known theory of helping us understand some of the dynamics of child sexual abuse, and it will be particularly relevant to all fields of work. We've had some input around witnesses, and I think it's very, very telling of why children might retract, and why they're not able to say what has happened to them. It is a clinical opinion, and it is anecdotal and backed by research, but I can certainly say from my experience of working with young children that I have seen this process in practice. So what we know is that children who have experienced sexual trauma and who have been groomed, there's an element of secrecy around the act. Either that's accompanied with threats that you mustn't tell anybody what's happened, or you feel so ashamed or guilty about what's happened, there is a need to keep it secret. And then that's coupled with feelings of helplessness. Can I talk about this? What will people think about me? What can I do about this? Why is it happening to me? And a child becomes entrapped and accommodates that abuse. There may be, and usually this occurs when it's adolescent years, there may be opportunities to give delayed or unconvincing disclosures. So sometimes a child might say, I've got to tell you something that's happened to my friend. Or, I saw something on TV that this happened. What will happen to that person? So there's some element of disclosure, but what tends to happen because of the systems around us and because it's such a hard subject for people to hear, and because some of the threats that have been used to maintain the secrecy start coming true, it is easier to retract. I made a mistake. I was lying. No, this didn't really happen. That's a process that children can sometimes go through. Now, when we look at the impact of the syndrome and the impact of trauma on workers, we can see a very similar process happening, particularly if they are working in organisations that are not able to support their staff. So workers that are struggling, that are maybe experiencing some signs of trauma, are pressured to keep it a secret, because you are not a good worker if you start feeling ill. You're not a good worker if you say to somebody that I can't cope with this. Then enters the feeling of helplessness. What can I do with this? Why am I feeling like this? Who can I tell? And then workers begin to accommodate and internalise some of those stressors. And there may be delayed or unconvincing disclosures, and I've seen that where they may talk to a peer. You know, how do you feel when you've done this? You know, when you were listening to the story, how did it feel? But if the organisation is not supportive, if there is no supervision, effective supervision, it's likely that that will be retracted. I'm okay. I can cope with this. I've been trained. And there will be a retraction. So that's a very good model that somebody has looked at it in the context of the impact of trauma on workers and how the feelings and experiences and the behaviours of a child can then be mirrored in an adult or a worker. So as supervisors, we have to be aware that this may impact on our workers in this particular way and think about what we can do in an organisation that would minimise this or prevent this. So we've already kind of had an explanation about what is trauma, and there's lots of different terms that it can be described as. Some of those you will recognise. They're the kind of, I suppose the professional term is vicarious trauma. But all the staff that I've worked with have described it in this way, that they are tired of being compassionate all the time. They are tired of working long hours. They are tired that there is no one to listen to them when they want to talk about the experiences that they have. So some of the points that I want to emphasise is that anybody working with traumatised children, there is going to be a personal cost. That's a given. You know, it's not something that you can separate from your professional life to your personal life. The emotions involved in working with trauma can be distressing, they can provoke anxiety and raise personal issues for the practitioners themselves. They can affect a professional's well-being as well as their ability to work. And as supervisors, we have to look out for this. And welfare-oriented work is not a science. You know, I can ask 10 people the same question, how are you today? And I will get 10 different responses. There's nothing that a book will say, this is what they should say. So we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. You are working off the hook. You are reliant on what comes to you for you to form a professional judgment about what's happening. So those answers aren't there that often people are looking for. So working with anxiety is a big feature of working with trauma. Therapeutic interventions expose workers to a whole range of issues for transference and for counter-transference. And those of you who are therapists will understand that they are very subconscious processes, that an individual, if you are submerged in that process, you will not see. And you need support to be able to talk about some of those issues and be challenged and being asked to think about whether that might be a feature of your practice and how you can begin to manage that. What we know is that the emotional consequences of this work is not mitigated. It will affect the worker and the service, but ultimately the children and families that we are trying to help. So it has a direct link to practice. It shouldn't be seen in isolation. This is about the organisation, this is about the worker. It has a direct link to the quality of service that's provided to the people that we are there for service. And quite often, you know, I've had workers that have come to me and they talk about one case, and I've talked to a colleague and they say, well, they've only had one case. You know, we've got staff here that are dealing with it for years and years. Why are they so suddenly affected by it? They're not going to be good at their jobs. But what we know is that, you know, trauma can be impacted on one-off event, or it can accumulate over a number of years. So not to dismiss it if it's a one-off kind of incident. The ways to kind of manage levels of trauma amongst professionals is with supervision and peer support. There is some small-scale studies in the UK with social workers. I know I presented some findings from psychiatrists and psychologists. A small study in the UK of social workers, you know, showed a whole range of things that were impacting on workers. And one of the things that they identified that really helped them was good, effective supervision and a good team around them. Likewise, people that were there. So it's really important. And what we're moving to is to have an organisation which informs trauma-informed care. That's what is offered to the workers and the practitioners of that particular service. Now, it's not about any kind of supervision, it's not about any kind of training. I think those that are working in welfare work, it involves a certain kind of supervision to help us understand and deal with trauma. So supervision has to be a reflective process, and I will talk a little bit about that. The other aspect is that we're probably all familiar with, it needs a physical and emotional safe space, and the opportunity to examine work of the practitioners. And the goal should be about enhancing both the person, who they are as a human being, and their professional growth. They can't be separated. It's about competence, and it's about higher level of service. So these are what we're aiming for. And supervision has to be embedded in an organisation. You should have a supervision policy. It should be a dedicated time. It should be a right of a worker, not something that is available to them in an adult way. And for supervisors who are providing supervision for workers working with trauma, they require critical knowledge of trauma, combined with an understanding of supervision, and focusing on the interrelationship of those. It's really important that those three kind of things are addressed. So when we work with children, one of the things that we're trying to foster is building resilience. You know, we had an early speaker, Caroline. Her view was that you could never recover from abuse. That was her perspective, and I respect that. I've heard from other survivors that you can recover, you can mend the hurt and deal with the hurt. And a positive factor there, or a key factor there, is resilience and strength. And supervision can foster that resilience in workplace. It provides that scaffolding there to hold them up while they're working with some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Other factors are emotional intelligence, and that might be something that you may want to read up on, and not to lose sight of the kind of commercial. But most of all, it's relationships that are at the heart of good practice. And the relationship between a supervisor and a supervisee, a relationship with the worker and their organisation, are equally as important as the relationship they have with a child or an adult. You cannot separate the factors. When we look at supervision, generally it has four functions, and you arguably can't separate those functions. During a particular session, you may access one more than the other. But supervisors have to be good managers. They have to manage the cases, the organisation. There has to be an element of being an educator, so imparting the knowledge that you have about good practice, about any research that you've read that might help the practitioner. They have to be a mediator. They may have to mediate between the organisation. We've heard of some very difficult stories about impact of the media and the stress in society in general. Often you need to mediate between those two different forums. And equally as important, you have to be supportive. You have to be supportive to the practitioner. So some of those are covered there, so I will kind of skip that particular slide. And when I say what kind of supervision, what we're advocating as good practice is what we call reflective supervision. And this is about enabling staff to question their practice and critically analyse their work. One of the things that was noticed in a lot of research in the UK about practice is that practitioners failed to analyse. They were very good at talking about feelings and experiences and then moving on to action. So there was very little emphasis on, well, why might this be happening? What can we do with this? So it's important that analysis and evaluation is part of that. This will lead to better understanding of the cognitive and emotional elements of practice. So one of the ways that this can happen is that an organisation is one that is providing trauma-informed care. So this is an environment and a culture that understands the effect of trauma on service users, but also recognises its impact on workers. And there is a desire and will that people, the children and the clients that you might be working with, but also your workers, get the help and support that they need to work with people. It supports practice which does not cause additional harm. It places an emphasis on considering how trauma has affected individual life and their responses to or as a result of their experiences. And one of the things that I really like about trauma-informed care is that it shifts the blaming lens from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. And that should be there for the practitioner. These principles should be there for the service users, but also for staff and supervisees. Just flag up some of the key principles that underpin trauma-informed care. A sense of safety. Staff need to feel safe in the environment that they work. There needs to be an element of trust and transparency, no hidden agendas, nothing that's going on behind our backs. So if I say that I'm struggling with this work, I'm not going to be looking at being disciplined further down the line. Peer support, that there are people around that can help you. Working together is equally important. I think one of the presentations yesterday, I can't remember which it was, but it demonstrated the networks around a child or a woman that are working, and that collaboration and mutuality. No one organisation and no one person can respond to the needs of children and families that are working on. It takes a community, it takes a few organisations. And staff need to feel empowered. They need to have a voice and some choice. And an organisation which takes account of and understands what the cultural, historical and the gender issues that might be impacting on the worker and what that might mean for them. You know, certainly for me as a black woman working in a predominantly white organisation, in my early days that was neglected. You know, when I told my manager that I had experienced racism, going to visit a white client, that I was called names, wasn't let through the door, and it was increasingly didn't understand. Well, you're a social worker, you have to deal with that. Or, okay, no worries, we will get somebody else to deal with it. That didn't feel very empowering to me. And kind of understanding adult learning is important, particularly for supervision, because we do need to think about how do adults grow and learn. And one of the things that I wanted to offer as a model is Kolb's learning cycle. Some of you may be familiar with it. And this is a very effective tool because its application is a model of reflective practice. It helps us understand how people learn, how they develop, and what the change process is. And it provides a good model of supervision. Am I okay for time? Okay, so for those of you who may not have seen Kolb's learning cycle, I'm a big fan of Kolb. When we are involved in trauma work, or indeed any kind of work, the starting point of anything is with our feelings. You cannot engage with a child or woman who has experienced trauma without engaging on a feeling level. So supervision has to be starting with the experience. So we encourage our supervisors to be open to and aware and value the experience that they've had, and to make use of that experience and use supervision as a means to investigate that experience, to talk about some of those feelings, to talk about what might be going on here that's different from there, and how to deal with those. And then ask the question, why? So analyse what has been discussed, what has been flagged up, and then move into preparing for action. What do we need to do next? And I will give you an example of a supervisee that I had before I knew Kolb. And we had several sessions of supervision. I was a supervising social worker, and she was working with a case that involved domestic violence, domestic abuse. And on my third or fourth session, she said, I only managed to see the family once. Every time I've been there, they've not opened the door or they're not at home. I went on some training and learned about the cycle, and I thought I'm going to ask about this, and I'm going to use it as a tool. So what I found was that when I encouraged the practitioner to talk about the experience of her first visit, what happened there, should we go back and talk about that? She was able to say that it was very distressing for her, that the perpetrator was in the house, he was very aggressive and she was frightened. She also talked about the children saying to her that they were fine, they were happy, but she knew from her training that that's what children do, particularly in the presence of their abusers. And we talked about that, and as we explored what was happening after, I said, what about the follow-up visits? And she was able to say that on her first visit, that's how she knocked. On her other visits, she knocked and came home. And why was that? It was because the fear and the threat had become so overwhelming. So it's a good way to kind of use that. And when we looked at why and explored that, we were able to plan for her next visit in a better way. It was planned so that she had a co-worker with her. It was planned that she would write and knock harder, make sure that they were in, and if there wasn't a response, that we would contact other professionals to see who had seen the children, so that they were no longer invisible. But it's an example of how somebody isn't confident enough to say, because of how they might be judged, that I'm frightened, I can't do this, I can't do it alone, I need some help. And so if we combine this with the 4 functions of supervision, this model just pulls it all together. So as a supervisee, you have to be mindful, as a supervisor, you have to be mindful of your 4 functions. You have to be skilled in using Kolb, and that will benefit service users, it will benefit staff, the organisation, and also partners. And this just shows there is very, very little research that has looked into what the direct impact of supervision has been on the outcome of children, or child protection work in particular. So it is all kind of localised research, it is all feedback that we've heard from survivors, from supervisees that were affected by trauma. And what we know is that the quality of supervision impacts on the quality of practice, that impacts on the service users, and all round there are better income outcomes. You have workers who are able to work, and you have better outcomes for children. And the links are that they have role clarity, that they feel secure, that there's a sense of empathy and assessment, that you're working in partnership, you're able to sit down in a healthy way to plan your work and your intervention, and there is a person there who can help and intervene and support you, either through modelling good practice or coaching or passing on their wisdom on how you may deal with this. Just moving on to training, this is again an area that you know, is very close to me. It's an area that's very neglected in a lot of organisations. If there are cuts in the UK, the first thing that goes is the training department. I have recently experienced that and been made redundant. But it's a given that people do not resource training as well as they should. For it to be effective, it needs to be something that an organisation buys into. So it's an organisation-initiated process. And it's about learning and competence with the workforce. And the overall goal has to be about meeting the needs of service users, how to contribute to organisation goals, and how to meet the professional, and I would also say the personal needs of individual staff. And learning is slightly different in that it's a process and its outcomes, and it involves a change in individuals, in knowledge, skills, values, attitudes that stick, that stay with you. Now, for training and learning in the context of child abuse, it's very, very challenging, very difficult. We've heard over the days about the different attitudes and approaches survivors have had to kind of work with. They've formed barriers. We've heard from professionals about how other professionals, how their attitude towards children, to women, to anybody who is vulnerable and different, impact on the quality of service in their lives. With any training that's around children and child abuse and women abuse, the starting point has to be that you're encouraging a shift into somebody's attitude and their values. That is your starting point. And that is the most difficult area to train on. You know, I would say it's now impossible, and I have had years and years of experience, you know, and even in 2019, you know, I hear from my delegates, I was beaten as a child, it didn't do me any harm. So why are you talking about physical punishment? It didn't do me any harm. A lot of young girls have asked for this because it's the way that they dress. Or disabled children don't make very good witnesses because who will understand them if they can't speak like we do? So those are still a lot of the attitudes that are prevalent there and blocking there. So we have to deal with some of those attitudes and there. And knowledge is equally important because it gives practitioners confidence. When I was working in social work, I came from a background of direct work with children, and my training gave me the confidence to say to people, I was working in a kindergarten, and it gave me the confidence to say, a 2.5-year-old saying, my daddy's willy tastes nice is not normal. It gave me the confidence to challenge that. It gave me the confidence to, because of my knowledge about child development, to say that children usually who are 7, 8, 9 like to show off their injuries. I've got a scar here, I fell down, I've hurt myself, do you want to have a look at my wound? So if they are hiding it and covering it up, that is worrying. We need to explore that a bit more. So that's the kind of confidence it gave. I'm going to slightly rush through, okay. I hope that, I'll just end on this one because this is one of my favourites. So this is a cycle of unconscious competence. A lot of organisations say to me, we have very experienced staff, they've been with us 20, 30 years, they don't need any training, they don't need any education. And this cycle is a reminder of how subconsciously we can pick up bad habits, we can do things in a different way. And the example I use is driving. So at the top stage, the unconscious incompetence, when I didn't know how to drive, I didn't know how to drive. But I took driving lessons and I became conscious of how to drive. I knew that. But as I was driving, I picked up bad habits. I used to ignore the speed limit. Instead of holding the wheel like this, I was like that with one elbow leaning out. And I did things differently. If I was asked to retake my test, I would probably realise that I was an incompetent driver. Without that training, without that test, I would not have known. I would need to retake my tests and become consciously competent again, and then hopefully some of that learning will stick and stay with me so that I can work in a more effective way. So thank you. Sorry, a big rush and missed.